Hello, and welcome to Mystic Dog Mama, the podcast for soul led dog mamas, where you'll discover how to best nourish your dog and yourself, mind, body, and soul. I'm your host, Dr. Alexia Meller. Hi there, thank you for being here. Today is a special day because this is our very first Fetch First Friday episode. Fetch First Friday is a collaboration with fellow canine nutrition and holistic wellness consultant Stacey Renphrey of Hozho Hounds, where we will be taking topics, ailments, and conditions of your choice and teaching you how to use our Fetch framework as a way to start approaching them. If you didn't catch our episode where we introduced F.E.T.C.H, F.E.T.C.H is an acronym that stands for Fresh Food, Energetics, Targeted, Curiosity, and Holistic Health. Stacey and I developed this framework as a tool to help you, as the pet parent, gain more confidence in being your dog's health advocate. It works by giving you some practical things to look at if your dog is experiencing a health challenge. It also helps you to keep track of your individual dog's health journey so that you can better collaborate with your vet and other health professionals. It's the same framework that Stacey and I use in our canine nutrition and wellness practices in order to start understanding what might be at the root of a dog's health challenge and how nutrition might better be able to support the health journey, and also how other complementary therapeutic approaches might also be beneficial for the dog. We are kickstarting Fetch First Friday with an all too common condition that Stacey and I see in our client dogs: yeast. Yep, if you have a yeasty beastie, this episode is for you. We'll talk about what yeast actually is, the different ways it can show up, what causes it, and different ways to consider supporting your dog if they're in a yeast flare-up. We'll also answer some of your questions about whether or not to use probiotics. We'll talk about what a yeast die-off is and how to support the detox process. We'll also address the hotly debated topic of whether or not carbs feed yeast. We share our opinions on how to think about raw versus gently cooked diet options and how food energetics may play a vital role in your decision of what to feed your yeasty dog. Just a reminder that we're not vets, and this should certainly not be construed as medical advice. We highly encourage you to speak with your holistic vet about any health challenges your dog is facing. Our hope, though, is that you come away from this episode with some practical things to start looking at to support your dog with yeast, and some things that you can speak with your dog's vet and other health team members about. Now, before we dive in, just a quick note that this episode is sponsored by Aspirationary, which in full transparency is another project of mine where we create books, notebooks, and stationery to support you in becoming all you aspire to be. I'm really excited to announce that we have released a Spanish language version of our popular My First Period tracker for young girls and tweens in order to increase menstrual literacy and empower young people to become advocates for their menstrual health. You can learn more about our books on our Instagram, which is Aspirationary, spelled Aspirationery. Okay, on that note, let's go. Hi, Stacey. Thank you for joining me on this.
We're back again.
We are back, and I think it's time to let listeners know that we have a very special feature on the Mystic Dog Mama podcast, which is now Fetch First Fridays. Woohoo! This is our first Fetch First Friday.
Say that again, and it's trying to Fetch First. No, First Fetch Friday. That is a tongue twister.
First Fetch First Friday. Okay. So for those who haven't listened to our previous episode where I introduced Stacey and the fact that we are collaborating on this exciting new project that is our F.E.T.C.H membership, but more than just a membership, F.E.T.C.H is really about the way that we approach working with dogs as a whole dog and the guardians as a whole person. And as we mentioned in our last podcast, we're really looking at how can we create a space that helps pet owners to become advocates for their dog's health. And so we really want to prevent you having to come to us for therapeutic support for your dogs. We're here to support you with that if you actually do have a sick dog and you need help with that. But we really want to essentially put ourselves out of business when it comes to doing the therapeutic side of stuff, because we really want dogs to be healthy. And that comes from you as the pet parent feeling empowered and excited and informed about how to support your dog's health. You become your dog's nutrition guru in many respects. So part
Absolutely.
of, right?
Absolutely. Just so exciting. Just so exciting.
It is.
Really
And so,
is.
as part of it on Mystic Dog Mama, we're going to be having the first Friday of every month. We're going to feature a Fetch Friday episode where we will go through a topic of your choice. So we're starting off with something that's come up for us a lot in practice as nutrition consultants, but we want to open this up to you as the audience of what health challenges do your dogs have, or are you curious about, and you want to learn how to start addressing it, how to start thinking about it and approaching it from a F.E.T.C.H perspective. And we will go over again what F.E.T.C.H is, so you know what that acronym stands for. But we invite you to let us know what are the things that you need help with, and we'll show you how we approach it through the F.E.T.C.H lens. Sound good?
So, yeah, love it. Yeah, let's just do it.
Let's do it. So should we start with a refresher of what F.E.T.C.H stands for?
Yeah.
That's helpful.
Yeah. Start at the beginning, like we mean to go on. Absolutely. I think that's a great idea.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Do you want to take the lead?
Well, we've got we start with the F, which is where we begin with fresh feeding. Then we move on to E for the energetic. So we're looking not just at the dog's individual kind of constitution, but food as well, and supplements and kind of everything else that's going in from an energetic perspective, from emotions, things going on within the house, stress, all of those things. It's all energy. So we want to look and understand what's going on in that respect. T is for the targeted, which is where we start to bring in how we're utilizing the fresh food and then their energetics into a targeted approach. I'll put my teeth in specifically for your dog. Where did I get to? C, curiosity. So this is where we're getting curious about potentially why the symptom is occurring and why these things keep happening and why they're struggling with certain issues. So we want to kind of get curious and maybe dig a little bit deeper. And then that H is for kind of holistic approaches, how we can think about it from the biggest perspective, kind of zoom out and look at all the components that have kind of led to the symptoms and led to the issues that you're having, and how we could potentially review what we're doing and look at it from a different perspective and put different protocols in place, whether it is dropping pharma and the flea and tick and bringing in other natural ideas or more holistic ideas into how we're living and being with our dogs in that space. So it's just each step we're just asking more questions and getting more curious through every single level, and just thinking, what could we do differently? How does that work for my dog? How does that work for us in our life? You know, how can I bring fresh feeding in? How can I bring a more targeted approach? Because I need to understand my dog better. And how do I even do that? What am I looking for? What are the clues I'm looking for my dog in how they're an individual? So it's just every step. It's like a layer of an onion, isn't it? You just keep taking another one off, and you kind of get to the crux of it in the middle. And then you're learning to be an advocate for that being right at the middle and understanding, and how you can bring in all these other amazing modalities and build the team around your dog, whether that's us or whether it's an osteopath and your vet, because, you know, we're not anti-vet. We want to be able to work alongside our vets. I think that's really, really important. And the more that we can show our vets that we're advocating for them and asking those questions, I think that builds that relationship and that trust, that we trust them, but we do have questions and we do want to understand why they're being prescribed a certain medication, or what the benefits are there any risks, and how do we then make that choice as to whether we use those or not, or whether we use them for 6 months, or all of those questions. Because I think we just get so drawn into this is how we do it, but without actually questioning. And we need to kind of push back a little bit, and that not in a negative way, but just in a curious way. I think it's that way of putting that lens on it. It's just being curious at every single step and living down a rabbit hole like we do.
Like we do. Well, hopefully we can make it a little bit easier for you than the rabbit
We
holes.
can help you which rabbit holes to go in. I think that's the thing, like which rabbit holes apply to you and your dog, rather than doing all of them. Like Google is one big rabbit hole, and you end up just with a million rabbit holes to look at. Whereas when you actually target the rabbit holes, it becomes much easier.
Exactly.
Much easier.
It does. And I think it's helpful to say that we kind of came up with the F.E.T.C.H acronym by looking at how we were already working with clients. So Stacey and I, we've collaborated a lot, particularly on some of our more difficult cases. And that speaks to part of why we were creating a membership, because we know for ourselves, this is really hard to do in isolation. That actually we learn through community and through support. And that support aspect is something that's really missing when especially if you've got a dog with a health challenge or even a behavior challenge, or maybe you're the only person in your family or in your community that wants to approach things a little bit more holistically or a little bit differently with your dog. We need people to help us to put all those pieces together and create support. So that was something that we were doing for one another, and we wanted to emulate with the actual membership. But we took a step back and we were looking at what is working. What if we could kind of help people to become more empowered to ask themselves the same questions that we're asking. If we could kind of put it into sort of categories, how are we doing this? So that's where F.E.T.C.H came from, where we started to look at what are the first things that we're looking at. Food. What are you feeding the dog? Like, that's always the first thing. And if you've been listening for any amount of time, you know I'm an advocate for fresh food. So it's always, how do we get the dog onto fresh? And again, when we're talking about fresh, we're meaning both raw and gently cooked. So that's always the conversation, is having fresh food over processed food, ultra processed food. And then Stacey and I have a particular interest in energetics from a TCM perspective. And a big part of that is because of how we've seen it benefit our own dogs. And then when we've started to apply that with client dogs. So again, we've looked at what are we actually doing as a consultant? How do we translate that into a repeatable way of looking at things, almost like a formula for looking at things as a starting point, as a guide. And we want to teach you how we do that as well, so you can apply that to your own dogs. And again, if you want to be doing that in community, we have that support for you. But through this podcast series, we wanted to just use it really as a kind of demonstration platform for how we do it. And I wanted to say, I want to frame everything that we're doing with this. We don't know everything. We don't know everything. So if you're coming to us,
teachers something new, don't they? Every dog.
We are always learning. We're always learning for every single dog we engage with, every single person we engage with. If anyone is telling you they know everything about any kind of condition, run. Nobody does. And actually having that lens, being able to say right up front, I don't know everything, but I do know some things. This has been some of my experience. And actually, this gives me a starting point to then ask other questions. That is such an amazing place to be in. So I'm saying that to kind of caveat where we're coming from. Like, this is where we're at with our learning right now, and where the research is at right now, but also so that you, with your dog, feel empowered to say, I don't know everything, but I do know this. And guess what? You know your dog better than your vet. You know your dog better than we do. You know your dog better than anyone. And that is so important when we're starting to look at how we best support our dogs. So I just wanted to put that out there first.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You can't know, every dog will and every dog's journey will be so different, and the curveballs will be different. So you have to learn to adapt and be open to the fact that this isn't going to be linear. There isn't a one size fits all. It is going to be up and down. But the more you get to understand your dog and understand the F.E.T.C.H approach, the quicker and easier you can make those adaptations and changes to diet, supplements, whichever part of the acronym you're at, the quicker you get there, because you're understanding and you're able to make those decisions, or look at something. You'll turn a supplement over and go, no, I can immediately rule that one out because it's got so and so in it, and my dog doesn't do well with that. That one goes away. next? And it becomes so much quicker to kind of make that process of elimination about what do I try next? Well, I know I need to try a certain type of product, but finding the right one, that's how the process works. It just makes everything quicker because you can start eliminating things and trying
Absolutely.
the next thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. And it also helps you deal with a lot of the bombardment that we get on social media of this is the latest superfood, this is the latest supplement that everybody should be using, and all of that. And there can be a guilt that kind of comes up when you're like, oh, I don't know, or I don't want to do that, or I feel like I should be doing all these things. And so this whole process will help you figure out, is turmeric actually good for your particular dog? Maybe, maybe not. But you'll feel confident as you kind of move through this process in knowing and then making appropriate decisions, as well as being able to substitute. So if you're looking at turmeric as an example because you need help with joint support, you'll know some other things, or you'll know the questions to ask to find what is right for your dog for joint support. So that's the aim of the F.E.T.C.H method.
Oh yes. Oh yes. It's
All good. So today we're going to launch with kind of guiding you through the way that we've engaged with F.E.T.C.H with a particular condition that Stacey in particular has had a lot of experience with, because it feels like every other dog represents with this. I've had a few, but my God, has she had a lot of them. And that is one of our favorite topics.
Oh,
Yeasty
yes.
beasties.
Yeasty beasties, yes. I think I would say it's about 60 to 70% of the cases that I'm working with at the moment are yeasty beasties, and ranging from chronic to just starting and just being at the beginning, and others that have been dealing with this for years and are in a real state. And it's, yeah, I've been blown away just by the amount that there has been, but I think it's a real indication of how topsy-turvy and upside down the whole way we are with our dogs, and the fact that how in dysbiosis they are, how unbalanced and how imbalanced they are at the moment because of everything that they are exposed to in terms of toxicity and food and all of those things. It's just a reflection of what's going on, I think, and that's why so many of them have got it at the moment. It just seems to be that even the ones on fresh food, they're still struggling with it because there's other parts to the puzzle that just haven't been looked at, or it hasn't been tested for, hasn't quite found the right approach for them. So it's just rife at the moment. It really,
Yeah, it is. And I would say, actually, I think it's even more of an issue than we're even aware of, because I think that, we've both had the situation where we've come across dogs that to us very clearly are showing signs of yeast, but they haven't been tested for it. And so we send them back to the vet. And lo and behold, when they actually run the test, the dog comes back positive for yeast. So I think there's even more dogs out there that have yeast than we are aware of. But I thought it would be helpful. Well, we both thought, we were kind of going through how did we want to approach today. And we have
a lot of notes.
We have a lot of notes, so we will be referring to the notes. But we thought it would be helpful to kind of start at the basics and give you an idea of so what is yeast? When we're talking about yeast with dogs, what actually is that? What do you say?
Well, the thing is, yeast is really normal and yeast is a good thing. It's yeast overgrowth and I think that's the key phrase, it's overgrowth. So it starts to get in our head that we're not trying to eliminate yeast completely. We don't want rid of it because actually it's got a lot of benefits on the skin and in the microbiome in the gut. So we don't want to get rid of it, but we just need to help the skin microbiome and the gut microbiome balance it so that they're not overgrown, that the weeds haven't taken over in the garden. And that's where we've got to with yeast, because they have got to this overgrown stage. So they are really normal and we do need them. And it's the reason it gets overgrown is that even the word? Is that the right way to say it? The overgrowth happens because it's the immune system isn't able to keep those numbers in check. So, but the immune system is the gut microbiome. So if you've got dysbiosis within the microbiome, that's where the checks and balances don't happen, because then the bad guys get to take over and the good guys aren't there. There's not enough of the good guys to do the job of keeping those guys in check. So it all comes down to immune system, which then at the end of the day comes down to microbiome.
Yeah.
And it being wonky.
Absolutely. And so like with what you're saying there too, I think it's important to point out that yeast in itself, the yeast overgrowth, is actually a secondary problem. So
Yeah.
it's not that your dog has a problem with yeast. Your dog has another problem, and the yeast has taken advantage of that and overgrown. So I think it's always important, because I know I get the question, I know you get the question too. How do I just get rid of it? How do I just treat it? And it's not just about treating the yeast. It's not just about approaching the yeast. Yes, we want to do that, but it's also, we can't do that unless we can identify what the underlying problem is that's created yeast, as a yeast overgrowth, as the secondary problem.
Yeah, because I had a German Shepherd over the summer that when we tested, came back positive for yeast, and she was high. It was red it has a traffic light system. The test that we use had a traffic light system, and she was red, literally all over. But it was flea bites that was causing the yeast overgrowth, because she'd been struggling with fleas. So it was the fleas that had unsettled her system, and the pressure that was putting on her body then kick-started the whole yeast problem, and that's where the itching was coming from. So it wasn't necessarily the fleas, although they added to it, but it was the yeast that was then driven by the fact that she had a reaction to the flea bites. So it was just this other cycle. So it was looking at it from in that case, I suppose it's even a three-prong approach, because you're not just dealing with the gut and the skin microbiome, you've got to deal with the flea issue as well. So there will always be that other component. Is it an allergy? Is it something else that's triggered the reason why the immune system's gone wonky? Because we need to figure out what that third part of the puzzle is. So even that's just clicked for me. That hadn't even really, I've always said it's a two-pronged approach, but actually it's a three-pronged, because you need to understand that other driver that's causing that. So see, I'm always learning and always putting another puzzle piece here, that it's happening live.
It's true. No, it's so true. And I think it is just kind of having that awareness when it comes to dealing with yeast, that you need to look at the underlying things, and it could be multiple things. So this is where yeast is a really useful example for us to walk through the F.E.T.C.H approach to it, because it's not simple. And the other thing that should be mentioned with yeast in particular, it takes a long time. It's not a quick fix. And so those of you out there that are struggling and like, why does this keep reoccurring? We got rid of it and it's come back, or what am I doing wrong? Or I've tried all of the things. And we'll walk you through kind of typically what is done, what's going on in the body with yeast, all of that kind of stuff. We'll do that today. But I think it's helpful to have a sense of patience with yeast, because it does take a long time, and it often looks worse before it looks better. And that's part of the process. And that's also really uncomfortable. And it's often at that kind of critical point that we jump off the bandwagon. We're like, no, I'm going to go back to the steroids or whatever for the quick fix, or any of that kind of stuff. So we'll talk you through all of that, because it's helpful to know this can take months. This can literally take months, and that's part of the process. So having that in mind, I think it is an important thing when you are trying to support yourself as the pet parent through all of this too, because it's incredibly stressful. We get the fact that this is not just about your dog being uncomfortable. It is incredibly stressful for you as the pet parent. And so honoring, that's also part of the holistic component too, is honoring the impact that it has on you. So with all of that, is it worth us kind of going through and saying what yeast is? And so we've identified that when we're talking about it, it's an overgrowth, but also the two different types of yeast that kind of show up. And we're specifically going to talk about one today.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the Candida yeast, which is commonly referred to particularly with women, or in humans, if they've had antibiotics, it can be Candida that comes up. But with dogs, it's generally the Malassezia strain, for want of a better word. Species, I think, is the proper word, isn't it? The species, which is the one that we most often see, and that's the one that the test that I run, I don't run it, but when I refer to the company that I use, it's Malassezia that they're testing for. So I think, yeah, it's generally, that's the one we're dealing with when we're working with dogs. So I think that's the one we need to be aware of. And it presents in so many different ways. It's not just, I mean, lots of people will think, oh, it's that kind of in the ears and the cheesy Dorito smell and the pong, and that it's not pleasant. If you've ever smelt it, it's not a pleasant aroma. but it can manifest in so many different ways. I've seen it, and this is particularly in German Shepherds, just as a really subtle grey line in the groin, like barely anything, but there's something. And they were itching. The one I'm thinking of in particular, they weren't itching on their groin, they were itching on their back, because that's where they could get to, and that's where they thought it's almost like that's where they thought it was, but actually it was coming from another place. And it's almost like that deferred pain thing. It's moving, they're itching somewhere else, but actually the problem is somewhere else. And yeah, it's just been random. Some of it's been either really faint, and I've just gone, not quite sure, can we just test that just to be sure? And again, they come back high. But again, the vets don't, particularly in the UK, which is where I'm based, they don't seem to be regularly testing for it. They do scrapes for kind of mange and other things, but and parasites or any critters, but they don't seem to be testing for yeast as a standard protocol, which kind of really confuses me, because it's so prevalent.
Right.
I don't quite understand why they don't test for it like immediately.
But I don't think that they are in the States either, because the clients that I've had in the States, I've had to say, they've sent me images of what's going on. And I've said, I would go back to your vet and ask specifically for them to test for yeast. The vet hadn't done it, and they do it. And I think it's important. We'll get into this with the targeting, but so often I had this where the German Shepherd that I had actually was presenting with open sores, which is another way that it can show up. And the pet owner was just told it's a skin infection. And I questioned, is it a bacterial skin infection or is it a fungal skin infection? Because you treat them differently. She was given both antibiotics and an antifungal cream. And to me, that signaled the vet's not tested. The vet doesn't know. They're covering their bases. And the problem is, in particular, with this particular dog who had an absolutely wrecked microbiome, suffering from IBD, like tons of issues, malabsorption, all these issues, constantly on antibiotics. And so my concern was, we're just repeating the cycle of going nowhere in supporting the gut when we're not actually targeting. So I always say, somebody else was mentioning to me that their dog actually was tested for yeast after talking to me about it. I said, go back and get a test. Yes, allergies are kind of underlying some of it, but there is yeast there. And the vet was recommending like immunotherapy. Well, that's not actually going to get rid of the yeast. So we're talking about targeting with yeast because you have to test for it. That's the only way that we know that we can actually confirm. You get a test and then you target it. It's the only way to get rid of it. All of these other things that so many of our clients have come back to us, they've been on something with the vet, oftentimes steroids, antibiotics, all of that kind of stuff. And they're saying, but it's still here. It's still here. What do we do? And it's because it's not been targeted. So that the yeast is a really useful thing to look at when we're talking about targeting. But yeah, open sores was another.
And I've had a couple that have been on their back, and it seems to be, for my ones, it's been the wiry haired dogs that have had the open sores on their back, and it's been lower down their back, almost over towards the base of the tail. So they've had these little open red sores. But then you get ears are a major area for them, particularly in the long breeds, like the long-eared breeds, the spaniels, and any of the ones with the droopier ears, where the heat and they're just kind of dangling, so they're just a prime like growth area for them. But in between pads in the feet, so if they're nibbling and chewing at their paws a lot, but again, that could be triggered by a grass allergy or something else. So there's other components that will be part of that. I was just reminding myself of all the different, because it presents in so many weird and wonderful ways, but particularly in the groin, particularly around the genitals as well, you can get those grey speckly black dots as well, and sometimes the skin will actually go grey, like an elephant skin colour. So I've had a few of those golden retrievers where their whole groin has just been grey, and again, the vets haven't picked up on the fact that their skin does not look pink. And that, again, just baffles me. I can't, it doesn't look, so why are we not rather than just kind of like, oh, that's just atopic dermatitis. Well, yeah, we've got an issue, but what's driving that? Why is the skin looking grey? Because that's not the normal colour.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it's just kind of questioning that. But it can come as diarrhea. It can, because if it's the yeast within the gut microbiome, that can have an effect on output and all sorts of gut issues as well. So it can present in many different ways, and I think that's the other reason why you end up playing whack-a-mole a bit, because it will come up in different places and it returns because it kind of gets under control. But then the other guy, you're constantly, until you get a really strong solid microbiome that is flourishing with diversity and keeping those guys in check, you will be playing whack-a-mole for a while, and it will just pop up in somewhere else, and then you'll think, I've cracked it. But then maybe it is an allergy and something's triggered it again. Whoa, we're off again. So it's just being prepared for that, I think, and knowing that there will be ups and downs.
It's
not linear.
There will be. But again,
really
this goes back to dealing with the dog in front of you and where they're at and their balance. So if we're using kind of a TCM philosophy as a lens for some of this too, their balance is changing all of the time. So you might have gotten things into balance at that particular point for that particular kind of space that they were in, but then maybe you move house, for example, and that creates a load of stress for the dog. Or maybe they had, if they're a reactive dog, for example, and they had an incident, or that they were triggered really badly, and that throws everything off because they're in a stress mode. That's going to impact the microbiome. So they're constantly changing as we are constantly changing. So it's not about just trying to fix it and you're done. It's actually this is an invitation. This is one of the invitations I think yeast offers us. How are we responding to what is showing up in our dogs in that moment? And if you kind of take that lens, it makes it a little bit removes some of the stress, right? A little bit less stressful, that you're like, okay, we just got to readjust some things and we can do that.
And it's about maintaining that balance throughout the year, rather than just thinking this is how we fix it permanently, that actually I might need to adapt things during the winter because the central heating's come on. So we're creating that kind of, when they're coming in wet from walks and they're damp, and we might need to adjust things, but then come the summer, it might change again. And again, that kind of covers the TCM point of view, but as well, just from a practical point of view and supplements and all of those other things, that you may have to adapt things because it's not going to be as simple as I just use this probiotic and we're done. This will fix it, because it won't be. And as dogs age and they change and all of those other factors come into play, and whether they go off a certain protein, but then they prefer another protein, but that might actually trigger them, and how you adapt and roll with that. But because the more that you can feel confident with it, the fact that those changes will come up, and that our aim is balance over time and creating that kind of diversity, that's what we need to keep in the back of our head, that how do we support a healthy microbiome, rather than about how do I get rid of the yeast, how do I deal with the symptom. Well, no, let's look at how do we support the whole system. And I think that is such a big part of it, rather than getting caught up in the actual yeast. Look at the bigger picture.
What is the yeast showing you? What is the wisdom of the yeast, really? Like, it's showing you, it's a major indicator that something else is off, and so we deal with that. Yeah, exactly. Another thing that I wanted to mention about how it can present, I don't think that you specifically said this, you were talking about the paws, but also rust-colored fur. You'll often see that too. So if you're starting to see rust-colored fur between the toes, or like around the mouth, or even like around the ears, or down here,
and the chest area,
exactly, that can be a symptom of yeast. So we started talking a little bit about, like, from the microbiome perspective of like how a dog gets yeast, or why a dog gets a yeast overgrowth. This was a question that came in from a listener, and I 100% have empathy for the level of frustration too, of like, how has in this person's case, how has a sensitivity to a food resulted in a full-blown, full body yeast flare up. And I think a lot of people have that. So this is where we'll start to delve into how F.E.T.C.H is talking us through why this can happen from that lens, if we start to look at the food, the energetics, targeting, etc.
It's, I think, because it is so there's so many parts to it. It's having looking at why they're getting it. And I think that was one of the next things that we were going to kind of cover, is like, why do they get it? So we've spoken about the microbiome, but then there's a from the skin perspective, there's it's the sebum and the fatty acids within the sebum, and some dogs are more prone to having more of it, and that feeds the yeast. So that's why it tends to be in areas where they may be slightly more concentrated. So the groin, armpits, toes, I suppose, maybe not so much the toes, but because of where they are and the fact that they get damp and they get wet, and just thinking about the body as a whole in that respect. And I'm sorry, I'm just reading my notes as well, because there's so many parts to it. That's the thing, you're just trying to remember that there's so many parts to it. But yeah, the sebum thing and the fatty acids thing is a really important part. And I think that leads us onto this whole carb feeding sugar debate, because there's a lot of discussion around whether some people will say that carbs don't feed we're talking malassezia here, we're not talking candida, this is malassezia. There will be people that say carbs don't feed it, and then you'll get other people saying carbs do feed it. But they're both kind of right, and that's where there's an answer in the middle. And it's not necessarily that the carbs directly are feeding the malassezia, it's the fact that what the liver does with those carbohydrates, it converts them. Now, you can say this better than I can. It is
palmitic acid. So many of these words I struggle with, but palmitic acid I'm good with. But yeah, but to your point, that so we should say that malassezia is a lipid eating yeast. So it is not eating the carbs. But what happens, particularly when we have excess carbs, and this is why kibble becomes a problem. This is why feeding extra carbs, even in our fresh food diets, can become a problem. It might not be a problem for a dog without a yeast issue, without dysbiosis, but then when you've got a dog that's prone to yeast and you give them extra carbs, this is where the flare-up can be, that the liver converts those excess carbs into palmitic acid, which is a fat.
Yep. And then that's what feeds it. So it is that both sides of that discussion are right, but it's just that they're kind of missing the liver's the middleman in that whole process, and that it's not the sugars, but it is also at the same time, but it's not directly the sugars. And I think it's just that how we think about it from that perspective, so that if we are feeding too many sweet potatoes, for example, that is going to get converted and that is going to feed the malassezia, and that's the bit that we need to adjust and target and take out.
and that exactly, and that's why there are some people that promote that if you do have a dog with yeast, that you actually strip back all of the carbs for a period of time as a kind of an elimination, then you start to add some back in. I don't necessarily, again, it's per the dog, right? It's an individual dog. I still feel like dogs really need they benefit from the fiber that is in the non-starchy carbs for the prebiotic perspective, right? Because we want to feed the gut microbiome. But there is, I think it's helpful to make the differentiation between starchy carbs and non-starchy carbs. So feeding non-starchy carbs, thinking of like your dark leafy greens, for example, those can be really beneficial even with a dog with yeast. So except spinach actually promotes or brings a little bit of an interesting question, because it is higher in histamine. And we'll get into the relationship with histamine when it comes to yeast. But if you've got a yeasty dog, taking into account some of these fruits and vegetables that have higher levels of histamine that you might want to avoid. Fruits in particular, you want to kind of limit. Sugary stuff, limit.
We don't want those, but the other good thing we can get them is Cushing's disease, other endocrine disorders, but then the endocrine disorders brings in the whole neutering discussion, and that's a whole nother rabbit hole of inquiry. But we have to consider the impact that all of these things are having within our dog systems, and that when we start taking parts of systems away, things have to go in other places, and it is part of that. So Cushing's disease, I was just thinking what else we've got. Hypothyroidism. So you've got a couple of other diseases that could potentially be part of the puzzle, and potentially if they look, so again, that's where we get curious, and then we might look to see, well, what are the other symptoms of those? Is yeast one of them? Tick. But they also have something else. Tick. Right, now we need to test. This is where we go back to the vet feeling confident and kind of being an advocate and being able to go, well, you know, and not like I've been a Google doctor and I've diagnosed, but look, I'm curious that could we test for this? Because from what I'm reading and what I'm understanding, this could be an indication that something else is going on. And I think we have to remember that we're paying our vets, so that if we're asking them to do a test, there shouldn't be too much resistance. And even if they don't necessarily agree, I think we have, that's the advocate part, where we're standing up and just saying, well, no, actually, I think for my peace of mind as a guardian and as a ruling out process to see what else is going on. I mean, it's not quite the same, but we've both had this with the EPI cases with German Shepherds, where we've gone back and they've tested, and even though they've come back negative, the point is we've ruled that out now. So it's just one more thing that we've taken off of the table as a potential issue as to what's another addition to fueling it. So if we can just get confident in that, asking for things for us to rule it out, so that we don't get stressed, so that we're not constantly thinking about it and adding to that whole energetic side of it about our stress about why this thing's happening, because we're ruling out certain conditions, particularly some of the slightly more scary ones like hypothyroidism and Cushing's, because they would need more management. If we can rule those out, that's going to make our life easier, because then we know we're just dealing with yeast, or it might just be an intolerance to something. So if we can take those parts of the puzzle away and build a new puzzle with the information that we do have, that's so empowering. It just makes you feel so much more confident with what's going on and feeling that you know your dog.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
You have been able to take things out of the equation. I think that's really important.
Absolutely. I think this is a good time to bring up a listener question. Cheryl, thank you so much for sending in these questions about yeast. We're so grateful. But the question around home testing for things. So for example, you can ask at your vet to run a test for yeast, and basically they'll do a swab or a scrape and look at it under the microscope and confirm it for you. There are at-home tests that you can do as well. In the UK in particular, there's F.E.C.H Lab, right?
Yeah.
That runs a test. And same sort of thing. You just sort of swab different areas and put it in like a tube and send it off.
Yeah.
Easy peasy. Yeah. But Cheryl asked, what about the value of other at-home tests like hair tests for testing nutrients and minerals, and microbiome tests and all that kind of stuff? How does that help when we're approaching yeast? And I'd kind of like to talk with you about your thoughts on that, Stace.
I think microbiome is probably just an all-rounder for kind of, because it gives you such an insight as to what's actually going on in there, and you get a snapshot. Yes, at that particular time, like all of those tests are only ever going to be at that moment, at that stage. But I think microbiome particularly is probably top of that list in terms of at-home tests. The hair ones can be a little bit, some of them are better than others, and again, but it's difficult to discern which ones are the better ones from other ones. I mean, the reports, some of them look amazing and it looks like you're going to get so much information, but does that really reflect what's going on for your dog long term, or is that just happening in that moment? So it might not always be as easy to piece together the puzzle pieces, but it might give you an idea. There could just be one thing in there that just kind of goes, that's happened. So, but my gut would be gut microbiome, as I hope, to really understand what's going on in there.
Definitely. And I would even say, because I'm also conscious of the cost of all of these tests as well. Yeah. So if you're kind of weighing up whether or not I need to do this, the microbiome test isn't my first port of call. That's usually we'll try some other things first when I'm dealing with clients, where we'll do some elimination diets, and we'll talk to you about what that actually means. I do recommend doing an elimination diet with the help of a professional. I do think it's important, because basically what it entails is stripping things kind of right back, and then you start to build things back in a little bit over time. You do what's called like protein challenges, where you test whether or not the dog, because I would say the majority of intolerances is actually due to protein, comes down to a protein issue. So that's primarily what we're testing for, but these can take weeks and weeks. So I think it's helpful to not necessarily just do it on your own, but have somebody who can guide you through that, see how it's going, and make sure that your dog is getting the appropriate nutrition that they need. That being said, if you start to suspect that, oh, I noticed that Toby has a problem every time I feed him chicken, for example. Try not feeding him chicken for a little while, feed him other things, then introduce chicken back in and see if you have reaction, right? There are ways that you can start to do it that aren't a full-blown elimination test. The same thing with if you suspect that your dog has yeast, if your dog is having any sort of skin issue, I would cut back on the starchy carbs. If you're regularly feeding carrots, peas, sweet potatoes, those sorts of things, cut them
Pumpkin
out.
and
Yeah, just cut them out and see what starts to happen. And that can give you hopefully some relief, but it will give you a little bit of information. So there are ways that you can start to test whether or not something is setting your dog off. But
it's at-home tests, isn't it? But like the basic
the
at-home
basic
tests.
at-home test, exactly. But I do recommend, I mean, especially if you haven't listened to my interview with Carol Hughes on the microbiome, I definitely suggest going and listening to that. It's so helpful. But I think the fact too that, you know, again, the microbiome test is a snapshot of what's going on with your gut with your dog's gut at one particular time. So it's important to recognize it. You know, if you did the test again the next day, it would be changing. But given the fact that she has been gathering evidence for over a decade and seeing particular trends with what's going on with our dogs, and that more and more dogs are facing issues of really out of whack microbiomes. If you are trying other things and you're still having a problem, that's when I would suggest a microbiome test could actually give us some information. And especially when you're getting a test that's telling you which colonies, which, you know, species are out of whack or what have you, you can then, going back to the T and fetch, you can target. You can target instead of just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. So, and those tests, they generally run about like $150-ish. They're not cheap, but they're not also super, super expensive. So that's where I say if budget is a concern, try other things first. But if you're still having a problem, I do think it's a really useful test to kind of look at what's going on.
Yeah, I think once you get to that point where you feel like you've tried everything, that's where you get to. But I think I would always choose microbiome over any of the hair tests. That's where I would always go. If we're at that point where we need to do a little bit more investigation, it would always be microbiome because it's just so much more of a better indicator of what's going on and helps you target because you know exactly what you're dealing with. And if you know you know where the imbalance is and you know which bacteria are wonky and how to help rebalance that and create the diversity again, that's just like so helpful. It gives you so many tools to work with, what foods to introduce, whether you use a probiotic, which supplements, what herbs you might be able to use, all of those things, and then you tailor it to your dog. So it just makes life so much easier. But yeah, 100% try all the other, you can do your own at-home tests first, but if we're still struggling kind of 3 months in, that's when it would be like, do you know what, I think now's the time we need to start thinking about doing a microbiome test so that we can really understand what's happening in there.
Yeah,
because we're out of whack.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, awesome. So I'm kind of going through our
We had so many notes.
There's so much.
Mm.
But okay, so here's another helpful thing that might be contributing. We touched on some of this, but looking at when you're starting to evaluate. So actually, let me back up for just a second. We'll go back to so we're
so
saying
big.
There's it's so big. Okay, so we'll going back to F for fresh food. So obviously we're saying if your dog is on processed food, switch them over to fresh, and hopefully that will help with the issue. If it doesn't, then we're going to dig a little bit deeper. And the next one is energetics, and this impacts the F, which is why I'm saying this. So you want to look at your dog's energetics, but you then want to use that to inform the energetics of the foods that you're feeding, because a lot of dogs who have yeast issues actually are being fed inappropriately for their energetics. So this is why it becomes an interesting component. Do you want to talk a bit about what you were seeing as the trends with the energetics of the dogs that you've been
predominantly predominantly what I've seen over this summer, where I just seem to have been inundated with Yeasty Beasties, has been that energetically these dogs are cool. So they're the blanket snugglers, they're the sunbathers. They'll be the ones out there, you know, catching every ray, even in the summer, kind of moving around with the sun coming through the door. Sorry, not the summer, the winter. They will be finding any slither of sunshine to go and lay in, and they're just like, yeah, this is so good. But because they're so cold, and then they're trying to warm themselves up so quickly, and if we're feeding them energetically inappropriate foods, so they're having to continually try to warm up. That's why we get this damp, cold thing. And then that creates the heat. Because they're cold and they're trying to get warm, now we've created the heat and this dampness, which is just ideal opportunity for yeast to crack in and just get going. So yeah, obviously there's always going to be exceptions to those rules. And I haven't yet met a hot yeasty dog, but I'm sure I will, because curveballs love to come along. But as it stands at the moment, they've all been cool dogs. So I've had to kind of consider what proteins I'm feeding. So I would be looking to go to venison. I'd be looking to go to lamb. I'd be looking to go not consistently, because again, we end up in the situation, if you're only feeding hot or warm proteins, then you're going to end up coming too far away from their natural state. And we just want to get them away from the chronic cold. We want them just get to cool, where that is their natural state. Because the cold, just indicates that we are in a chronic condition and that they've gone too far. So we just need to warm them up enough to get to their natural state of cool. And that's where they are naturally stable and kind of in balance. At the moment, they're so far out of whack. So we just look at introducing those foods. And I found that some of them have been able to stay on raw, but my preference has been to get them onto lightly cooked, just because, again, it's a warm food. They're eating it warm. It's not such an attack on the system, and their body isn't then having to work really hard to warm them up, which is again creating the need to snuggle down and stay warm and find a blanket, snuggle up to their human and create more of that heat. So lightly cooked, or if you are going to do raw, we serve it at room temperature with some nice warm bone broth so that the temperature is body temperature when it's going in. So we're not competing cold and hot the cold and cold to try and create heat. So it's just looking at that bigger picture of what's going on for your dog as an individual. If they're a sunbather and they like to snuggle, you've got a cold dog on your hands. And if you've got a yeasty dog, I would love to know. So if anyone's got a hot yeasty dog, please tell us, because I want to know more. I really would love to know more of how that fits with that profile, because I haven't seen it yet. So I'd be really intrigued to know more. So please tell us if you've got one.
Yes, please, get in touch on Instagram at Mystic Dog Mama, or email me, and I'll put Stacey's links in as well. Again, constantly learning. We want to know. We want to know. But also, interestingly, when we were kind of like looking at this, so I have my little Lucky, which you can possibly see him on the chair back there. He's a cool dog. And one of the ways that I knew this too, so I've been asked, how do you actually know whether or not your dog is warm or cool? Watch them over a period of time and watch them over different seasons, get a sense of how they act. And one of the things that I noticed with Lucky that was just like pure confirmation, as we'd come off a walk where it was like so unbelievably hot. He was hot. He was panting. So he was showing signs of what you might think as a warm to hot dog. But then he came back home and he went back outside to sunbathe. Even if it was just for like a minute, he still had to do that. And I was like, oh, this was consistently. So he enjoys that. When it gets too much, he kind of comes back in. So you watch those kinds of things. They will give you some kind of clues. And also, he prefers gently cooked food to raw food. I can offer him some raw and he will turn his nose at it. I gently cook it, that same exact bit of food, and offer it to him, and he gulps it down. So he's telling me what is right for him. But what's interesting too, when we're talking about yeast in terms of gently cooked foods, there are bacteria on raw meats that produce histamine. So if your dog has an issue with yeast, there's a link with yeast and histamine. Gently cooking it can actually kill those bacteria. So that might be a helpful option if you're looking at feeding your dog, switching them over to a gently cooked diet versus a raw diet. But again, try the dog in front of you. It's always about responding to the dog in front of you.
And again, I think seasonally as well, that during the summer, they might cope better If it's warmer, they might cope better with a raw cooked diet. So it might be for, 4 or 5 months of the year, you can feed raw at room temperature. But in the winter, you definitely need to be moving over to cooked, because it is colder and their bodies are having to work harder to stay warm, particularly when they're going outside. So adapting to seasons and all of that, again, it's working with the dog and kind of seeing what works for them in that time frame. Like my Ted, complete opposite to Lucky, Mr. Hot Dog, will avoid the sun at all costs. Literally, if he needs to go for a wee, he will be out there for milliseconds and back in again. He will do everything to avoid it. But I avoid really hot proteins during the summer, so they come off the menu. I just don't offer them. But now we're coming into the autumn and winter here in the UK, they're back on the menu, so that's fine. But I'm adapting to his needs throughout the year, because I understand him, and I've got a better idea of what works for him and what doesn't. And in the summer, he coped so much better this year because I'd taken those off than he had done the previous summer before I'd kind of gone down that rabbit hole. And the difference was comparable in terms of how he was able to cope with the heat when we had those hot days. So all of those little clues, they're always giving us those clues, and they're always trying to give us those kind of self-selection nudges, but we just have to be a little bit curious.
That's right. Yeah. Exactly. And if you listen to my talk with Rita Hogan, back to what you were saying, Stace, about the extremes are what we want to avoid. That's where inflammation on both ends happens. That's where the dis-ease state happens. If I were to take Lucky as a cool dog and I were only feeding him cooling proteins, like duck every day kind of thing, I would actually push him to that cold state where yeast could develop. So it's both thinking about, if your dog currently has yeast, how do you deal with that and through the energetic lens, but also how do you prevent it by using the appropriate foods to kind of keep them in their ideal state and not push them to the extreme of cold or the extreme of hot. So that's where 100%. I think.
And I think it's also important, whilst we're kind of covering the TCM point of view, is about that when steroids get used potentially to treat yeast, because it's one of the go-tos, we'll do steroids or an anti-inflammatory, but steroids in particularly, they are damp from an energetic perspective. So you're adding more damp to the damp. So they're having to warm up. They've got more damp in their system. You've got more chance of it perpetuating and making them. So even though initially I think this is when you get the reoccurrence thing happening, because initially it might look like it's worked because in that moment and the plaster has worked. But then actually when the body's adjusted to what's just happened to it, whoosh, we come back again. So it's just looking at every single thing that's been added in and how that might influence that individual dog, rather than just, well, this is what works. Well, it does it, but for my dog, maybe not. Right. And having the confidence to play around with that and be curious. I know we keep saying it, but it really is about curiosity. It really is just about asking questions all the time and just taking notes and keeping a diary of just things like what you're feeding and what happened that day. Was there a stressful event? Have you just moved house? Has there a new neighbour moved in next door with the crying baby? All of those things, they're all factors, and that they're all indicators to us of things that could be triggering it or adding to it. So I think just creating an awareness and being curious about why it seems to flare up at one particular time or it's work. So if it is a seasonal allergy that's flaring it, we can work on the seasonal allergies so that we don't get the yeast reoccurrence. So this, it is such a big topic, but I think it's such a great one to use under the F.E.T.C.H lens, because there's so many parts to it that you can start playing around with. And it's like the volume controls, or like on those old, if you're as old as we are, but the old, what were they, the equalizers and all the different ones. It's just finding the sweet spot for your dog and just kind of playing around with them so that you get it right.
Yeah,
and that
exactly.
They're changeable.
Exactly. And I think, and like we said, this is how we approach every single dog, every single situation, and using curiosity, asking a lot of different questions. We've been able to come to different, I guess, conclusions, or at least found some other missing pieces of the puzzle that the pet parent has been able to take back to the vet, for example, by asking these different questions. And so that's where we're encouraging you to do the same thing. Ask as many questions as possible.
Yeah.
And tied into that with curiosity, we didn't mention this, but I think it is worth bringing it in here, that certain breeds do seem to be predisposed. So this becomes another part of your puzzle piece when you're looking at it through a curiosity lens, like, oh, okay, so do I have an Australian Terrier or a Basset Hound? I'm going through the list now. Shelties, Bulldogs, every version of Bulldog, right? Literally every version of Bulldog.
Particularly, I will just say for any of those kind of Bulldog breeds, the designer colours, the blues and the merles that aren't the natural standard colours, particularly from what I've seen, are the ones that will struggle the most, that we have these big skin issues. And I mean, this is all bull breeds. This is going from the French Bulldog, old time English Bulldog, up to the Pitties and the XLs and all the mixtures that are in between that. When you've got the standard whites and the reds, they seem to be okay. But when I call them the cookie dough ones, where they've got like the merle cookie, it looks like cookie dough. But those ones, and when you've got the merle coming in, and although the ones that they weren't ever meant to be but have been bred in, they're
predisposed. Yeah. And also 100%. To your point, any of these mixes too. So I'm going to say poodles next. So thinking of doodles, that kind of a thing, that they tend to be prone to it as well. Lhasa Apsos, Cocker Spaniels, Westies, German Shepherds. Those are the biggest ones that I've got on the list. So that's another piece of the puzzle. So if you're like, okay, so there might be a genetic predisposition that's going on as well. It might not be allergies. It just might be their genes. So then that helps you who they are. So that helps you attack it from different angles, but again, including the fresh food and including appropriate energetics. So it's putting all these things together. And then, so we talked about how it's diagnosed. So we only know it's yeast when it's diagnosed. So it's not a guessing game. We might look at something, we might look at a dog or a photo and think 100% we think it is, but we obviously cannot diagnose. Nobody can diagnose except your vet. So have them test or order an at-home test and have that done. And then you can start targeting things. In terms of treatment, do we want to talk a little bit about what's kind of traditionally done and some other things that we have found to be helpful?
I think, again, I mean, it's so easy to say that one thing's going to work, but when you go back to the whole thing about the fatty acids and how every dog is going to be different, so their reactions to certain treatments are going to be different, and their gut microbiome, but it is coming at it from that now I'm going to say three-pronged approach, that we're kind of dealing with the side issue, we're dealing with the gut microbiome, and we're dealing with the skin microbiome. And traditionally, you try and say it, I can never say keto.
I've always said it ketoconazole, but I don't know if that's correct.
Beautiful.
Ketoconazole.
What she just said. It's like that. Is that an antifungal? Is it an antifungal? Yeah. So they're the traditional ones, but again, a lot of those ones, and the medicinal shampoos are just kind of like your case. Throw everything at it, because we're not actually quite sure, because they haven't tested. We're just going to throw everything at it. So we'll just see what bit works. Right. Which doesn't actually help because we're not targeting it. So yeah, the medicinal shampoos.
But on top, you're not only not targeting it, but those shampoos. So we're talking about the skin microbiome and the gut microbiome, the same way that antibiotics will kill the entire gut microbiome. The same is true when we apply it topically. We do that to the skin microbiome as well. And so you've got the same issue, that you're creating the opportunity for opportunistic pathogens, which yeast can actually come back. So if you're not actually doing something to support at every level, it will just keep flaring up. So I think that's important too, that it does kill it. Yeah. But I also wanted to kind of highlight too, some of the stuff that you were talking about, like in the cases that you've been working with, you've gotten creative with different ways of actually topically addressing yeast. And a big part of that is we first have to basically break down the biofilm that yeast creates around itself.
Yeah, it's so clever, and it just protects itself. So this biofilm comes around it, and it's that bit that. So to even get to the yeast, we need to break the biofilm to actually get into actually do anything. So it's acidic things that seem to be the thing that kind of get in. So I've been playing around with, well, not me, but we with dogs that I've been working with their guardians. We've been some of the traditional stuff hasn't been working, so we've just been looking at other options and going down rabbit holes and investigating what type of things would work. And apple cider vinegar in a 50-50 solution with some like cool boiled water, use that to start to break down the biofilm, and then you can add in some kind of antifungal treatment. So I've been using lucillin. I think you can get that in the US. I think Dr. Judy Morgan stocks it on her site.
So. But another option is Cotter Brady's Propithium that is available in the US as well.
So I'd got to the point with one dog that seems to be working at the moment is that we're doing 3 to 4 days of the apple cider vinegar dilute and 50-50 solution, because it's an ear issue. This one, Cocker Spaniel, red Cocker Spaniel, cold, cool boy, dangly ears. We've got issues. So they're doing 4 days of the apple cider vinegar and cool boiled water to clean out, and then they're using the lucillin, and then we're doing a day of propathium to go in and really kind of knock the yeast out. So it is working, and the gunk and the smell is coming down, and it's easing, but we're probably about 3 months in, and it's still kind of but he's been dealing with it for 7 years. But he hadn't ever got to the point where he'd been tested. The vets just kept saying it was an ear infection. So yes, there would have been an ear infection because of the yeast and the scratching and all of the other issues, but we'd never dealt with the yeast. They just kept dealing with the ear infection. So you're not dealing with the whole problem. You're only dealing with one part of that issue, and it was the ear infection. So every time they put the antibiotic drops in, wiped everything out, yeast comes back. So of course the antibiotic drops work. Couple of weeks, looks great. Oh, he stopped itching, wonderful. Then as everything starts repopulating, the yeast just takes over because there's no good guys to keep them in check. So you just end up in this vicious circle, and that's why for him his journey is taking longer, because this is so set, and he's a predisposed breed. So you've got all of those, and energetically he's cool. So you've got all of these aspects that we're trying to bring together. But with the treatment, this one particularly at the moment seems to be working with the apple cider vinegar propathium balance. But again, we'll adjust it, particularly as we're now coming into winter, more damp, coming in, central heating being and on. There may be some other things. So we've even said about potentially when he comes back from a walk, getting one of those snoods to pull his ears up, just to let them breathe. Once they've been cleaned out, let them breathe and just get some ventilation rather than them drooping and creating that kind of heat, just getting them up and out the way. So we're trialing, and it is trial and error, because you have to figure out what works for your dog. It is really tricky. And I appreciate us saying this all the time, like we have to get curious and ask questions, and it feels like so overwhelming. But like I said, the more that you ask, the easier it becomes to eliminate.
That's right.
That's not going to work for my dog. You just get a quick note, that's not going to work. Next one, I can try this. Oh, this could work. So yeah, I think it even though it might still sound overwhelming, it doesn't once you kind of find that rhythm.
Yeah, I agree. And when you see the patterns, and then you see the missing puzzle piece, and it's like, okay, great. And that gives you something to go forward with. I did want to just make a little caveat though about the apple cider vinegar that you'd mentioned too. Don't use it on open sores.
Open skin. Yeah.
So long as it's not an open sore version of the yeast, you can use that.
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah. And I think it's, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say colloidal silver is great as well. That can be another one to help break down the biofilm, because it can get in. And there are, on the lucillin camp, there are some people that are concerned because it is antibacterial and antifungal, because it will kill everything off. But by using the propathium and using and supporting the gut microbiome, we can encourage the good guys to come back, because sometimes we do need to clear the way so that the good guys can come back, and encouraging a healthy microbiome. So it's finding that balance between clearing enough of the bad guys away but not killing everything off, and
That's right.
the apple cider vinegar being fermented probiotics. So there are other there's so many bits.
There are, but also I'm glad you said that as well. Like we do, it's kind of getting away from this fear that we have too of like antibiotics. We should clarify that we're not antibiotics. It's excessive and inappropriate uses of antibiotics that cause the problem. So there are going to be times when you need to go in and kill stuff. Like that's part of it. But then there are also other things, like I know that Ingenious Probiotics has a range of like sprays, probiotic sprays for the skin. So once you get to a certain point, you can start using some of that too to help rebuild the skin microbiome and increase healing. But you do have to break the biofilm down and get rid of the yeast. That's the only way.
Yeah, you can't just put the probiotics on, because it's not going to get through. Yes, it will help rebalance some of the other guys, but the yeast is still going to be there. It's not the solution. That's the maintenance goal at the other end. Once we've kind of got to the point where everything's settled, we need to get to that point. But first, we kind of have to kind of clear the decks to reintroduce the good guys and get them more balanced, rather than just trying to put the good guys in, because the yeast is too strong.
Exactly.
They're too established.
Exactly. Well, I think this is actually a good time to answer a question around probiotics and yeast, because so probiotics and digestive enzymes are two questions that have come up about, should I be using probiotics when my dog has a yeast flare up? And if so, what should I be using? And are digestive enzymes helpful in this case too? And if so, how should I use them? So I think it's a good time to kind of address that. What have you found really helpful with your yeasty beasties?
I've been using soil-based probiotics because they're going to get further down, so they're not going to get killed off. So we've got more chance of kind of re-establishing the good guys further down. So I've always used soil-based, either the Soil and Sea from Adored Beast or the 4-leaf Rover Protect, which actually I've been using more of recently because it's got the Saccharomyces boulardii. That's the one. See, I am no good at pronouncing any of the words. I'm going to leave that all to Alexia. But it has got the chlorella in. It's got some of those other detox agents, which are brilliant at supporting the system to get rid of the yeast. So that's why I like those ones. And both products, the Soil and Sea and 4-leaf Rover Protect, they both have chlorella and fulvic and humic acid in, which are brilliant for detoxing the bad guys out. So they're the ones that I've particularly been using, and we've been using Yeast Guard from 4-leaf Rover as well, but that has to be used alongside a soil-based probiotic, because of what's in there, it does have some antibacterial elements to it, because we do need to get the yeast under control, but we don't want to knock out all of the good guys too. So you have to use it alongside a soil-based as well to help repopulate and kind of maintain that kind of change of guards, for want of a better word, of swapping the good guys and the bad guys over. So I think, but that might not be the case for every dog. I think, again, it's working with your dog and seeing whether they work, because sometimes it might be that it causes them digestive upset if you put too much in, you've used the wrong one. So it is a little bit of trial and error to see whether the probiotics will work, or whether you can use it, whether you can feed prebiotics and use food as the source and the fiber, which is what we were talking about earlier, but the non-starchy ones to get in, or even whether you could feed some garlic as a antibacterial type of approach and come in at it from that way, and what you could add into the diet that way, potentially, rather than using an actual product. So again, every dog is different. But one of the things that has been shown, and this will sound sort of like ironic in a sense, but one of the things that has been shown to be really helpful with yeast is actually the S. boulardii yeast. It's a gut friendly yeast. It's a good guy yeast that has been really helpful in helping to fight yeast infections. So either looking for a kind of probiotic mix that has S. boulardii in it, or some places, I think 4-leaf
barley
Yeah,
ferment
they
does sell
yeah.
just S. boulardii as well. That's something to add into your rotation. But again,
Yeah.
the same thing with probiotics. We want to be targeting, and you want to be kind of rotating through and
Rotating.
see how your dog does on it. As Stacey said, like, not every dog is going to do great with every brand or every type at every stage of their journey. So this is again where harping on curious, but watching, marking down, keeping a track of how they're doing with things, and then you adjust accordingly. But these are some things you can kind of pull from. And in terms of the digestive enzymes, part of this sort of links, I want to link this too as well. Let's talk about the yeast die-off situation and why you were mentioning things like chlorella and the clays, fulvic acid, humic acid, why those are important to consider when we are dealing with yeast. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, because it's got to go somewhere, hasn't it? We're killing this stuff off. It's got to go somewhere, and it can create what's called there is a fancy word for it, but as we all know, I'm not very.
Herx,
Yes,
I think
I'm going to go with
Herximer.
Herx.
Yeah,
I'm just
a
going to go
Herx
with Herx.
response. Herx
So,
response.
and that can come out in various ways. So it can come out on the skin in the fact that things are going to get worse before they get better because it's got to come out, or it can come through kind of diarrhea and loose stools because they are detoxing. They have got to flush it out. But by using chlorella and some of the
Humic acid, fulvic acid.
the acids, thank you, and the clays, they help bind that. So it just helps get that out of the system more efficiently and not creating so much toxicity in the body as it's coming out. So they're great for kind of grabbing hold of it as it dies off, but it is part of the process, and why quite often it looks like it's getting so much worse before it gets better. And that's the point when people generally will go, I can't do this is too much. And it's horrible seeing your dog be uncomfortable and either have an upset tummy or itching more or the redness appearing more, or it is horrible. But sometimes it's just, we have to kind of just hold the faith that we are. And again, from an energetic perspective, knowing that the body is doing what it's designed to do and that this is part of the process, and holding the fact that the body has to release it, particularly if you've got a dog that's had it for a long, long time, that has been dealing with these issues, that there is a lot of build up and it has to come out. We have to allow the body to heal, and that will look different for every dog. And most of the time, particularly for the ones that have been dealing with it for a long time, it's going to look pretty horrid for a period of time. And it's how we adjust to that, and putting and reframing it that actually this is a positive thing, that this dog's body is doing this because we're introducing this fresh food, we're taking out certain elements, and the body now has the tools to do what it's designed to do. And looking at it, reframing it, I think can be so helpful, rather than just seeing it as, my God, this is terrible. Well, no, actually, let's just see what happens, because this is the body responding to having the tools. So now let's see what the body can do, and just put a slightly more positive approach to it, rather than, and from an energetic perspective, that's going to have a massive shift because you're going to feel better about it. The dog's going to feel better about it. So we're taking the stress out of the situation, which isn't fueling it. So again, it's so much more than just a symptom on the skin. It's how we can reframe it and how we could look at it differently, I think, is really important.
Totally.
So, yeah.
Totally. And also to kind of add on to that too, I think it's helpful to know that the yeasts are also binding to heavy metals. So this is where, like, using organic food, if you can do that, is also helpful. But why we want to bind them up and push them out, that's part of the detox process. So we always want to think too, when we're dealing with these, how do we support the detox? How do we support the liver? And that can be done again through an energetic perspective of feeding foods that feed the liver. So there are different ways, again, putting all these puzzle pieces together, and we'll sound like we're just like beating a dead horse, beating a dead drum, beating a dead horse.
Yeah.
About the curiosity, but it has been so helpful for us as we've been dealing with some of these more complex cases of putting these different pieces together and realizing, oh, we need a little bit more liver support. So maybe actually I can be feeding like dandelion greens, for example, to support the liver. Or maybe this particular dog needs some herbal support in regards to helping the liver out. And so we can start to look at those kinds of things. So kind of taking, again, that bigger picture, asking different questions, but helpful to remember about the importance of detoxing the liver to get rid of not only the dead yeast, but also all the crap that it binds to, and pushing that out of the dog's body.
Yeah, and I think the liver part is another great section of the discussion around yeast as well, because if we're over vaccinating and using those chemical flea and tick treatments as well, because of the toxins that are in them, they will be fueling the yeast, they will be adding to that. And not only that, the liver has then got to work even harder to get rid of that, so you're putting more pressure on that kind of that cleaning system that we have within our body, and this amazing organ in the liver that is so good at helping us get rid of stuff. We have to support it. So the liver is another great big part of that puzzle piece, I think, as well. So yeah, I think it is really important to be considering the liver in that whole process, and all the other, and that's where the kind of holistic part comes in, I think, isn't it? After the curiosity about what's causing this, why is my dog in dysbiosis, what's happening, then moving on to the H part and the holistic. How could I do this differently? Do I need to vaccinate this year, or could I do a tighter test? Could I look at doing a more holistic approach to flea and tick treatments and worm treatments? And we were speaking before we came on, weren't we, about different areas and where you live, that you have to weigh up the risk and benefits. Absolutely. Again, it's not like we're anti-antibiotics, and we're not in the right situation at the right time. If you need to use some of those preventatives, you have to make that decision for yourself. But can you support the liver whilst you're doing that? So that, again, we're not adding to the additional pressure that we're putting on the liver and the kidneys, because they're part of the detox system as well, and the skin, because we've got to remember the skin's detox organ. It's got to come out. So if it's a spot on, and when they scratch and they're bringing it towards their ears and they're bringing it here, and that's where you can, you start to put those puzzle pieces together about where it's coming out. So yeah, it's that when you get to that H part, what could I potentially be doing different? How could I look at those things that I'm doing? And plugins, I mean, people don't realize with plugins that the candles, the
scented candles and all
scented candles, the stick things, not necessarily the incense sticks, but they sit in oil, don't they? And then
the air freshener type sticks. I forget what they're called too. Yeah.
But all of those are releasing stuff into, and particularly you've got to think where dogs are. They're on the floor, so of course they're laying on this stuff, because it all settles. It doesn't stay in the air. It settles, and that's where they're laying. That's where they spend most of their time. They're breathing it in. They're laying on it. We have to think about those things as well. It's just another part of that the end bit of how can I look at this differently, and what adjustments could I make to the washing powder that I'm using, to the scented things that I'm using within the house, where I'm walking them, because that type of grass seems to irritate it, because I've been keeping a diary, and when I walk on that field, or when I go in this neighborhood, or when I go here, we seem to have a flare up, because it could be that someone's used a pesticide on their grass as you've walked past. That's flared it up, because there's so many elements to it that it's just keeping that awareness of things that could be impacting it. And so if you have been out and you know that they struggle with going to that field, for example, what could I wash them with when I get home to kind of take that off? How could I help the skin rebalance so that it's not sat on their skin? What could I change my floor cleaner to? Do I steam mop my floors? The list is endless, it just goes on. But every little thing becomes a puzzle piece, and just starts going, this works. And don't forget, all those changes that you're making for your dog will benefit you and your family so much as well, because taking those toxins out of your dog's life, you've taken them out of yours as well. So that's a winner. Come on.
Exactly.
That's huge.
100%. 100%. Thank you so much for bringing all that together as well, because it's another missing piece of the puzzle. Like, if you've got a dog with an underlying allergy to something that's in your floor cleaner, it doesn't matter how many other things you change if you keep using that floor cleaner. So again, it's just another thing to kind of eliminate. Try it, and this goes totally. And this goes back to something that we talk about a lot when we're dealing with dogs, that there's this tendency to want to throw everything at them. You've heard try this, you've heard feed this, you've heard all of this stuff, right? You've gone on maybe your own Google rabbit hole, right? And you've got like this list of, I need to do all of these things. start slow. Even though this comes up a lot in the probiotic discussion, like, should I be using probiotics? And that's not always the first port of call. Like, oftentimes it's really paring back and start with prebiotics and see how your dog is doing with it. And you try one thing at a time. You change one thing at a time so you can then identify. And if you're keeping track of all this stuff, it's so much information that you can go back to your vet and say, look, this is what we've been dealing with. And that helps them put the pieces of the puzzle together as well. Like, it sounds like it's going to take a lot of time. It sounds like it's complicated, but in actuality, it makes it so much easier. So much easier.
Because once you just kind of think about, right, the food bit, I can, how am I going to address the food part? How can I address the energetics part? How can I target it based on the food and the energetics? What can I do? And then I'm just going to get curious about what might have triggered it or what keeps triggering it. And then the H part, what changes can I make? So actually, it's so straightforward. And at the heart of it is going to be microbiome. The more diversity and the stronger we can support the microbiome to be, you're supporting the immune system to defend against all sorts of other nasties that might be around. And that's the seat of that. And I would probably say the liver as well, just because of it being a detox organ. So kind of supporting those two systems, I think, really central to
anything. Absolutely.
That targeted bit, that's the bit. Like, target the microbiome and supporting the liver. You're probably onto a good thing. You're good. I did want to just kind of swing back to digestive enzymes, because I know that we didn't really talk about that. And so whether or not to use digestive enzymes. And I think, again, this is case specific, but in one way, they can help break the food down a lot more quickly. They can also help to quickly digest and eliminate dead yeast cells. So they can serve as that kind of that detoxification function. But the specific question that came up around digestive enzymes is, should you feed them with food or should you feed them in between meals? I have heard mixed. I've actually recommended mixed approaches with dogs, depending on the particular dog. I mean, I had one dog that just would absolutely not eat the food when it was mixed in, but would eat it with broth. So you're working with the dog in front of you, getting something in. But always with these kinds of products, follow the instructions that are on the products. That's kind of the best thing, because they will be formulated in a particular way that they're meant to work. So there isn't really one right way. There are also different types of digestive enzymes. And I think that's important to highlight, that you've got pancreatic digestive enzymes, and you've also got other enzymes that are in food, like bromelain and papain, that are in pineapple and papaya, respectively, that kind of a thing. And so they operate differently. But I mean, I think it is, in the case, if we're talking about how to use it with yeast, I think that they can be a useful tool in your toolkit. And I think as well, it also speaks to the fact that digestive enzymes will help break everything down. So not only that get rid of the bad guys, but will help the body break the food down to access the nutrients and the amino acids and all the goodies that are in there, so they can be synthesized into all the parts that the body needs. And again, support the microbiome to do their job. So if you have got a B vitamin deficiency, for example, or some other things going on because the body isn't breaking them down properly, if we can help another step, great. But again, you need to try it to see if it works for your dog, because it might cause some digestive upset. It might go the other way and it might just be too much.
Right.
So it's testing them and seeing. But again, I think sometimes we need to test them and need to be aware, but you might try it for a couple of days and see something, but sometimes you might actually need to do it for 3 or 4, 5, 6 days, because it might just be that that's a blip as the body's adjusting. But if you've used it for kind of 7 days and you're continually seeing the same issues, then that's not really working for your dog. But if you need to, again, it's testing it for your dog, and you know what works and what bit doesn't. So, but just being aware that those first couple of days, it might just be an adjustment, and that you might, on the other side of that, it might be okay. But because a lot of people might just go, oh no, it gave them the runs, or well, actually that was just clearing something out, it was doing something really good, it was just shifting something out, ready so that it could actually get to do the job that it's meant to do. So not being fearful if it might create a bit of digestive, if it's continuous every time you use it, then we know it's a problem. But if it just happens when you initially use it, I'd probably say just keep going for another couple of days just to see, unless it's chronic, they're in pain, and then you change it. But if it was just a little bit of digestive, just see how it goes, because it might just be it's clearing something out.
Exactly. And that points back to what you had mentioned earlier too, that often with yeast, things look worse before they get better. They can look a lot worse. So, but that's also recognizing that the body is just going through its processes, but you just want to watch it. So if it just keeps getting worse, that's when there's an issue. But you often see a turnaround. It's kind of like it's darkest before the dawn sort of thing.
Yeah.
Is there anything else? I think we've kind of covered. I know this is a bit of a longer one, and we've gone through a lot of stuff.
Sorry, peoples.
No. I think we've covered the basics of what we wanted to cover on yeast from a F.E.T.C.H perspective. So
I think digestive enzyme food. I was just kind of looking, and it is difficult. It can be frustrating, but the more that you attune to your dog and everything that's going on around them, the more you can start actually going, aha, that bit works, that bit doesn't, that food doesn't work, this doesn't work. So I fully appreciate it. Must sound really overwhelming in the beginning, like, God, it's another thing I've got to do. It's another process I've got to think about. But when you actually break it down for what it is, it's actually really simple. And when you find your rhythm with it, magic.
Absolutely. And you'll be able to apply this in all other areas with your dog. So I think one of the biggest takeaways beyond the specifics of kind of how we were walking people through each of the kind of letters of the acronym, but I think kind of underlying it is observe your dog and track things. The more that you can do that is the key to actually understanding what's going on with your dog, to seeing the patterns that you might not have seen initially, or you think also on the flip side, you think something's been happening a lot more than it has. And you're like, well, actually, it's not that bad. This has only happened once every 2 weeks, for example. So getting into the habit of tracking what's going on with your dog will be super, super helpful. And again, you can use the F.E.T.C.H acronym to kind of support things, but also within that kind of links back to the energetics. Note the time of day that things are happening, because we've seen a huge correlation using the TCM circadian clock, which takes the perspective that energy is running through various parts of the body at assigned times. When there's an imbalance with a system, you'll often see behaviors like itching or dysregulation or zoomies or any number of things.
Witching hour.
The witching hour, exactly. That happen around the same time repeatedly. So when you start to notice that can give you an indication that there might be an imbalance with the system. And again, if you have that information and you come to somebody like Stacey or me with that of, I've been noticing these things, we can help you to put those puzzle pieces together and identify this is how we're going to target treat then. But the same thing is too, if you feel like this is an appropriate and exciting way for you to start working with your dog and you want to learn how to do this more in community, come and join us in the membership. Become one of our founding members, and we can do this together, and we can talk about this together, and you can geek out and nerd out, rabbit hole out with us if that's something you enjoy doing. But we can help you within community put those pieces together as well.
And I think as well with that, just going kind of back to the TCM perspective as well, it's where that it's showing up on the body as well in pores. That there's certain meridians, there's certain points that can indicate that that's an imbalance, that they're chewing at it. They're literally showing you where we need some extra support. So it might be liver, it might be kidney, it could be pericardium, it could be lungs, it could be something that you wouldn't necessarily associate with yeast, but that's leading to the dysbiosis, which then causes the yeast. So again, just zooming out, looking at the bigger picture. So looking at where the yeast is presenting, where is it? Why is it? Is it just because of the sebum, or is there something else going on as well? Yeah, it's fascinating.
It's so good. I hope you guys have enjoyed our first episode of F.E.T.C.H Fridays. And let us know some other topics that you want us to cover, and we'll make sure to do that, show you how to do that through a F.E.T.C.H lens. And Stace, anything you want to say?
No, but just if anybody does have a hot yeasty dog, I'd love to know. I really, really would love to know if anyone's got a hot yeasty dog. Just to understand what that dynamic looks like would be like, that's a rabbit hole for me. That's all.
100%, 100%. So please get in touch either at Mystic Dog Mama or at Hozho Hounds, and I'll have all of that information in the show notes so you can contact us directly from there. Stacey, thank you for doing this with me today. This is so fun. So much fun. And I will see you for the next Fetch Friday.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining Stacey and me for our very first Fetch First Friday episode. I hope that you enjoyed it. Did you find it helpful? We're testing the waters with this, so if there are any things that we can do to better help you, please let us know. And like we said, we'd love to know if any of you have a dog who has a warm, energetic profile and also has yeast. If you do, please send me a DM on Instagram at Mystic Dog Mama, or contact Stacey through Instagram at Hozho_Hounds. I've left these links in the show notes. If this approach to your dog's health resonates with you and you'd like to learn more about becoming a founding member of our F.E.T.C.H membership, where you'll learn in community how to become our dogs and our own empowered health advocates, then send me a message on Instagram at Mystic Dog Mama or get in touch on my website, mysticdogmama.com, and I'll send you some more information. Our January Fetch First Friday will focus on canine cognitive disorder, or CCD. So if you have any questions about that and how to support your senior pups, send me a DM on Instagram at Mystic Dog Mama, or again, get in touch through my website, mysticdogmama.com, and we'll be sure to address your questions. And let us know what other topics and other health conditions you'd like us to address through the Fetch lens for future episodes. Okay, until next time.